Welcome to part 2 of our look into Alfred Wegener's The Origin of Continents and Oceans, the 4th edition, published by House of Commons Library. There is an inside footnote or description. An important group of problems that faces modern geologists is how to explain parallel formation that are separated by great distances of sea, accounting for isolated life forms in widely separated areas, such as lemurs in Madagascar and India. Explaining pre-Pleistocene glaciations, or Pleistocene glaciations, and similar problems. The usual explanation has been to assume the one-time existence of land bridges or parallelisms, or diffusion with lost intermediary steps. In 1915, however, one of the most influential and most controversial books in the history of science provided a new solution. This was Alfred Wegener's Entstehung der Kontinente, which dispensed with land bridges and parallel evolutions and offered a more economic concept. Wegener proposed that in the remote past the Earth's continents were not separate but formed one supercontinent, which later split apart, the fragments gradually drifting away from one another. Wegener then explained various phenomena in historical geology, geomorphology, paleontology, paleoclimatology, and similar areas of science in terms of this continental drift. To back up his revolutionary theory, he drew upon a seemingly inexhaustible fund of data. Later editions of his book added new data to refute his opponents or to strengthen his own views in the violent scientific quarrel that arose. Even today, this important question remains undecided, and geologists are divided into strongly opposed groups about the Wegener hypothesis. At the moment, it seems to be gaining steadily in acceptance. It is one of the two basic theories of Earth history, and since it has often been misrepresented, in summary, every Earth scientist owes it to himself to examine its theories and data. The only English language edition, the third, has long been unobtainable. The present edition is newly translated from the fourth. The Origin of Continents and Oceans, Alfred Wegener, translated from the fourth revised German edition by John Biram, with an introduction by B.C. King. By a bibliographical note, the first English edition of Die Entstehung der Kontinente und Oceane, published by Methuen in 1924, was a translation of the third 1922 German edition. The present edition is the new translation of the fourth 1929 edition, first published in the USA in 1966 by Dover Publications Incorporated, and now photographically reproduced with a new introduction by Professor B.C. King by Methuen in 1967. The German editions have all been published by Friedrich Wieweg and Sohn Braunschweig, and this edition is produced by special arrangement with them. And there's the contents page. Introduction by B.C. King, Professor of Geology in the University of London, Bedford College. Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift may well be judged the most stimulating and fertile of the major geographical concepts of this century. Wegener presented his theory in 1912, but the first comprehensive account was his book, which appeared in 1915. The initial reception was almost entirely sceptical or incredulous, in some quarters even hostile. Moreover, the idea was not entirely new, for F.B. Taylor had already in 1908 elaborated a similar notion, largely inspired by the remarkable fit of the coast of South America and Africa. The fact that Wegener was a meteorologist and geophysicist did little to commend him in any essentially geological field. Wegener, however, was sustained by conviction in his arguments, and he devoted himself to studying the ever-growing body of geological and geophysical literature relevant to his theory. New editions of his book were published in Germany in 1920, in 1922 and in 1929. Each was a complete and assiduous revision of the last, in which he reframed and elaborated his arguments in the light of criticism and advancing knowledge. Growing interest in the work is shown by the fact that the third edition was translated into French, English, Spanish and Russian in publications that appeared in 1924 and 1925. It is, indeed, the English translation of the third edition, published by Methuen and Company in 1924, with which readers are most familiar, and supposedly not available anymore. The present volume is a translation of the fourth German edition of 1929, which differs considerably from the earlier, for it was largely rearranged and rewritten. It profited not only from Dutoit's publications on his book Our Wandering Continents was in due course based, published in 1937, but also from the criticisms, mostly adverse, contained in the Symposium on Continental Drift, which had appeared in 1928. Not least important, it incorporates much from the joint work with W. Kirpin in 1924 on paleoclimatology. Wegener was already finding that keeping pace with the rapid growth in relevant literature was unduly onerous, but his untimely death in Greenland in 1930 deprived us of the possibility of any further elaboration of his ideas. Although it is almost 40 years since this particular book, was written, it comes as a surprise to find how much of the argument is entirely acceptable today. The presentation of the evidence is masterly, but many of the ideas are unexpectedly modern, probably because so often they have been adopted by more recent writers. For example, the buckling of the orogenic belts to the north of Australia, the lagging island festoon between Tierra del Fuego and Greenland, the separation from Africa of the Seychelles and Madagascar, the clockwise rotation of the lands around the Pacific, attested by strike-slip faulting, the dilation of the Red Sea coast, the notion of subcrustal currents, the downbuckling of oceanic crust to produce deep sea trenches with negative anomalies, and the notion of the widening of the Atlantic by welling up of substratum to form new ocean floor. Wegener, in the foreword to the 4th edition 1929, states, and we quote, "Scientists still do not appear to understand sufficiently that all Earth sciences must contribute evidence towards unveiling the state of our planet in earlier times, and the truth of the matter can only be reached by combining all of the evidence." End quote. This is the farthest he goes in censure of his critics, for he spares little time digressing from the course of his argument and dealing with them severely. His critics thought otherwise. The stratigrapher and paleontologist were content to refer to sunken continents or land bridges, not because of any inherent plausibility, but because their validity lay outside their terms of reference. Many are quite categorical in their condemnation of Wegener's hypothesis. Thus, Schuckert, 1928, page 143, asserts that progressive geology meets the knowledge of orthodox geology and grants it the permanency of the Earth's greater features, a knowledge of which the geographer of ancient life has built his paleogeography. A Pangaea, the postulated single continent that began to rift in the Carboniferous and wandered apart after Jurassic time, would never explain the life of the seas and lands as seen by the paleontologist. Edward W. Berry, 1928, page 194. Objected to the Wegener hypothesis because 1. The method of presentation is not scientific. 2. The facts of geophysics do not support it. 3. It fails an explanation of geological climates. And 4. Paleontologically, it raises more distribution problems than it solves. The geophysicist Bailey Willis was equally forthright in his denunciation of the hypothesis, 1928, page 81. Having endeavoured to give the theory of continental drift that impartial consideration, which should be according to every hypothesis that may possibly advance research, he was forced by the author's own statement of the argument to conclude that the original suggestion of the idea sprang from a similarity in form in which itself constitutes no demonstration, that if the drift had occurred in the manner described and with the results deduced by him, then the actual similarity could have not survived but must have been destroyed by faulting. that the hypothesis is in other respects in contradiction with its necessary consequences, and that, for these reasons, it should be rejected. Wegener had, however, two great protagonists, Arthur Holmes and Alex du Toit. The theory of continental drift made an immediate appeal to Holmes, 1929-1944, not only because it explains so many structural and stratigraphic resemblances on either side of the Atlantic, but also because he perceived, at least in general terms, a mechanism for drifting, namely convection currents, which he had inferred to be inherent in the behaviour of the Earth itself. This is a notion which more recent work has very largely substantiated. Du Toit, 1929, with his wide experience of South African geology and having made a comparative study of South America, seized on Wegener's theory as quite the most plausible explanation of the astonishing geological similarities between the two continents. Wegener was himself delighted with such authoritative support. He said, "I must admit that Du Toit's book made an extraordinary impression on me, since up till then I have hardly dared to expect so close a geological correspondence between the two continents. Du Toit's later books, Our Wandering Continent, 1937, and The Geology of South Africa, 1939-1954, provide very full documentation of the geological evidence, so much so that it is not a little difficult to understand O.T. Jones' contention, 1964, page 27, that, quote, 30 years ago he had opposed the idea of continental drift on the ground, that not enough was known of the geology of the areas concerned," unquote. Despite the lapse of time since Wegener completed the revised 4th edition, it is timely that the English translation should now appear. Particularly in the last 10 years, there has been a remarkable, that's in the time of this book being written and published, right, revival of interest in the theory of continental drift, for new techniques, chiefly geophysical, have led to the development of much additional supporting evidence. So much so that whereas when Wegener wrote the consensus of opinion was predominantly adverse, it is now very largely in favour. Wegener's work has assumed a prophetic quality with which its earlier rejection is in keeping. A more objective appraisal of his arguments is now possible. They are as worthy of attention today as they were when they were written.